Good morning. Welcome to the garden. I'm glad you all have chosen to be here on this somewhat chilly morning in November. And I'm really glad to see some of the St. Luke's folks who showed up over here this morning. You're quite a drawing card, buddy. Quite a drawing card. Anyway, we're here every Sunday, so you're welcome to come anytime. But today we are observing Veterans Day, something which we haven't done every Veterans Day in the history of our 18 years history of the garden. And I can't tell you why we've chosen specifically to do it this year, except it just seemed like the right thing to do. And we're very honored to have someone to help us observe Veterans Day. Dr. E. Carver McGriff is a longtime friend, a very dear friend and colleague, my mentor, and a veteran of World War II. So will you help honor him and welcome him? Humility is his greatest virtue. Carver was
and I'm proud of it.
I thought you were. Carver was one of the young 19-year-old soldiers who went ashore after the wake of the Normandy invasion, which began on June the 6th, 1944. He came into Normandy 4 days after that, and he was one who fought valiantly. He was a POW, and he was wounded during the war. In 2007, he wrote a book entitled Making Sense of Normandy, in which he tried to do precisely that, to make some sense of what that experience of war was all about. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, based on some of what he shared in his book. Carver, it's obvious that you researched extensively to write this book, and yet in all the years I've known you, that was not something you talked about very much. And I knew other people who had been veterans of World War II who also didn't say much about it. So can you share a little bit of what it was like to begin to revisit those experiences and to collect them and write in that book and to try to make some sense out of the whole thing?
Yes. By the way, I'm honored to be here with what I consider one of the outstanding Methodist preachers in America.
You didn't say that the other two services. I paid him.
Well, you forgot to tell me to.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead. Do you remember the question?
Yes.
Okay.
I was, like most, who came back. Incidentally, only about 15 or 18% of the men who served in the armed forces during World War II were in actual combat. And it is mainly those who didn't talk about it very much for a variety of reasons. In my own case, I put those things in the basement of my memory and thought little about it until after I retired, I began to go back. I think it was things like Brokaw's book about the greatest generation, and the movie Saving Private Ryan. Those things kind of gave us veterans permission to talk about what had happened. And when I retired, I began to go back in my mind. I realized there are many books available about the history of the times, and many books about the heroic people who served and did so much. But what I didn't find, and what I wanted to write, was a book that asked the question, what's it like, what does it do to the human spirit to be placed in the situation of a war? What does it do to the president of your church youth group if he is drafted into the service, given a weapon, and told to go out and kill somebody? What happens? How do we respond to all this? This is what I wanted to talk about.
And you did it beautifully. I found the book intriguing to read and yet very hard to read. And yet there were several things that captured my attention. One was how ill-prepared most of the boys, and they were boys, who went into combat were to actually face that kind of trauma. And there was also the confusion that you indicate in the book that one group didn't really know what another group was doing. Those on the front lines didn't know what was going on behind them, and there were times that you really didn't know who was in charge. One of the things you talk about quite vividly, I think, is the assault on Hill 122 to try to take it back from the Germans, to drive the Germans off the hill. Would you share a little bit about Hill 122 with us and what that was like?
Yes, I might comment that we think of the Normandy campaign as being pretty much D-Day. Well, that's the beginning, but the campaign lasted 2.5 months, and most of the casualties were suffered long after D-Day. One of the objectives that was of crucial importance was a place called Hill 122. By coincidence, I was watching the History Channel a few days ago, and they actually reenacted that battle. But it's not a well-known battle, and yet just over 1,000 young men died on Omaha Beach on D-Day. 1,500 American boys died trying to take Hill 122. It was an awful battle, and I was part of it. Fighting in Normandy was strange because the planners did not know about the hedgerows, and hedgerows were 6 feet, 7 feet tall. They were thick, maybe 2 feet at the top and 4 or 5 feet at the bottom. They were like brick walls surrounding these fields. And one photograph that covered 8 square miles showed more than almost 4,000 fields surrounded by these hedgerows. So we would fight in a hedgerow, or maybe fight isn't exactly the word. We would be in a hedgerowed field, and another platoon might be in the next hedgerow field over, and we didn't know the other was there. It was so confusing and so difficult to move. That's why it took 2.5 months to get out of that tiny little peninsula. And unfortunately, our leaders knew very little about how to fight in the hedgerows. So even up to the rank of general, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of unnecessary casualties.
You became a POW when you and the men serving with you ran out of ammunition and you were surrounded by the Germans. Could you describe what that feeling was like to realize you were no longer able to do what you were there to do?
Yeah. Well, there were about 400 of us in this particular group who had been surrounded by a German parachute regiment. We were outnumbered 3-1. I've been able to go back and study the history of this, so I know details I didn't know then. And we were slowly running out of ammunition. Finally, the point came when we were out of ammunition, and the Germans were closing in. And my vivid memory is of standing up and seeing the Germans moving up on us. And I raised my rifle and started firing, and then it jammed because the heavy rains had created so much mud that everything was all filled with mud and dirt. And then the Germans got close. I didn't mention this before. There was a heavy German tank out there, a Panther tank that was immune to any weapons we had, that was moving in on us. One German soldier jumped into the ditch where I was with several other men. He was maybe 10 feet from me, and a man standing next to me shot him and killed him. And I thought to myself, now that's going to make him mad. Well, we finally, and then a hand grenade, German hand grenade, landed next to me. And in the movies, they always show them guys picking them up and throwing them back. Well, I didn't pick it up and throw it back. I flattened myself on the ground, and it went off. And fortunately, I wasn't affected by it. Some of the others were. Anyway, we finally had to surrender. And there's a period of time, the worst thing about surrendering to the enemy was you're right on the front lines, and frequently they would execute prisoners. Both sides did it, I'm sorry to say. But we put our hands up, and they marched us into a little town nearby, lined us up to search us, and an artillery barrage landed right in our midst, killing and wounding Americans and Germans. There were 3 men in my platoon whom I did not like. They were Mexicans. They spoke a language I didn't understand. Their skin color was different. Their culture was different from mine. I grew up on the north side of Indianapolis. Knew nothing about people like that, so I avoided them. When I was wounded by that artillery fire that landed on us, I felt myself being picked up by a man who, like a baby in his mother's arms, and carried to safety by a man who risked his own life to do it. And I looked up into the face of the man who was saving my life. It was one of those Mexicans. I learned a great lesson then. I would never, ever again look down on another person because of skin color or language difference or culture difference. And I don't believe I ever have.
I certainly have never known you to. One of the unique abilities you have is always to see the best in everyone that you encounter. And in the midst of this horrible experience, you share about finding compassion and kindness and love in some pretty unlikely places with those who captured you and with those who served on the other side. Could you talk about the German soldier and share the story about the canteen too?
Well, yes, as I was placed in a little cafe with about 25 other men of my unit who had been wounded, and they placed me on a table, and as I lay there, a German sergeant came in, walked over to me to inquire about my state of affairs, and I said I was thirsty, so he handed me his canteen, and it was filled with hard cider. So I drank most of it. For a while, things didn't seem so bad. But then the next day, we were transported to a hospital in the town of Mortain. They carried us there on a makeshift ambulance. And as I was lifted out on a stretcher, I looked around and I could see hundreds of men lying on stretchers, almost all of them German soldiers who've been brought there to this medical facility, probably men who had been in the same battle in which I'd just been. And I was placed next to a German boy who was a paratrooper. He was wounded also. We both were in a certain amount of pain. And we looked at each other, and it's hard to describe. We bonded. It was almost as though each of us saw in the other a man who'd served his country honorably, was now off the field of battle, and we could almost become friends. To my amazement, as all those other Germans lay out there wounded, needing medical care, they took me ahead of them, carried my stretcher into a facility where I received medical care, and I still wonder to this day how I managed to be placed ahead of all those Germans. But it told me that there among the doctors, the German doctors, was compassion and kindness. And that's the way I was treated at that point.
Could you share a little bit about your fellow soldier who was Jewish? And
I had a friend. I didn't know him then. I know him well now. Bob Levine is his name. He was in the unit at which I was a member. And he was wounded, captured by the Germans, and placed in one of their field hospitals. He was unconscious for a while, and when he woke up, he was horrified to realize his foot had been amputated. But he reached in the pocket of the garment they'd placed on him, and there he found a note from the German doctor who had done that surgery, apologizing and saying, "I'm sorry, I had to remove your foot to save your life." But he also found out that his dog tags were missing. That was a little metal ID that we would wear around our neck. And what he realized was that being a Jew, and this being indicated on his dog tags, now they were missing. But when he reached in his pocket, there they were. And he realized the doctor had hidden those dog tags because he realized that Bob, being a Jew, might not have had his life saved by some of the people there. So he felt that his life had been saved twice by this doctor. Many years later, Bob and his wife went over to Germany, and after some lengthy search, were able to find where that doctor lived. And he went to the home, and the doctor had died, but he met what was either the doctor's daughter or granddaughter. I cannot remember which that was. But she became his friend. And she said she'd always wanted to go to the United States and go to college here. And so Bob and his wife said, "Then you come and live with us." And she did. And I thought, what a wonderful story, because it was a story of an enemy who reached across the chasm of hatred to perform an act of love for a man, and that man later was able to return that by reaching back across that chasm with his own act of love. And so in the midst of all of the hatred and the atrocities and the anger that prevailed there were acts of kindness and love.
Your story ends well. You made it through, and you lived to tell about it. Share with us, if you will, what it was like to find freedom again when you were rescued.
Well, the 8th Infantry Division came through the town where we were placed in a girls' school for temporary medical care. And I was a prisoner there for a month. And then the division arrived, started artillery fire on the town. They'd warned the people to vacate. But they didn't know about our hospital, so our hospital was receiving artillery fire and machine gun bullets. So we went down in the basement to get some protection down there. The fighting went on for 2 days, and finally things grew quiet. And I came up, crawled down the hallway, opened the front door, and there I saw the road that led directly into the hospital, and there came a line of American soldiers. And all of a sudden, it must be what salvation is all about. We knew we were free and could come home.
Your book is so aptly entitled Making Sense of Normandy, because it's clear that experience had a shaping event on who you are as a person, obviously impacted your faith and your life as a United Methodist pastor. In your book, you talk a lot about forgiveness and love. And so we've chosen a Bible passage this morning that talks about loving, and especially loving our enemy. I recall preaching on this particular passage at St. Luke's back during the first Gulf War. And it wasn't terribly well received. But it is a passage that would be considered controversial. This is how it reads. This is from the Message. You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend, and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer, for then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. This is what God does, gives the best, the sun to warm and the rain to nourish, to everyone, regardless, the good and the bad, the nice and the nasty. I know you forgive and you've preached about forgiveness, and yet it's a difficult thing to do. But would you share a little bit more about your perspective on how important it is?
Well, Marianne and I lead tours of Normandy now for people mainly from St. Luke's Church. And when we go there, we go to Omaha Beach, where 9,300 American boys lie, most of them who died on the beaches there. And I ask the people there to go in and don't just look at a sea of white crosses, but stop by a cross. Look down at the name of the boy who lies buried there. William Johnson, June 6, 1944. That's the day he died. Kansas City, that's his hometown. Say a prayer for him. Maybe nobody has prayed for him for a long time. Pray for that boy's eternal soul and surround him with a moment of love. Then we get in the bus and we drive over to the German cemetery, where 33,000 German boys' remains are buried. And I ask that each one of us go among those crosses. They are crosses, kind of iron crosses. And stop, pick out the name of one person, one boy. Say that name. Say a prayer for his eternal soul. And surround him with a moment of your love. And so, now we can be friends again. Well, a few years ago, our daughter, my stepdaughter, went over to Germany to help establish a church. And she met a young German man. They fell in love, got married, and now they have a 1-year-old baby. His name is Samuel Everett. He's named after me. And now the circle is closed, and I have a German grandson.
Well, Carver, I can't tell you what an honor and a privilege it is to have you. I've heard so many wonderful accolades this morning, and thank you for sharing your experiences here. I know that there are others here this morning who have served or who are serving in the military, and if you are one of those, would you stand and let us recognize you? Yeah. At the same time, I know that whenever someone is serving in the military, there's a family behind them, someone who's praying for them, thinking about them, loving them, and praying for the best for them. So would you, if you're a family member who has been in that place or is in that place, would you also let us recognize you? The words thank you don't seem big enough, but thank you. Thank you for all you do and all you have done so we can live the life we live. Your example inspires us to be better people, to serve one another, and to be the people of love and forgiveness in a world that needs it so badly. Thank you.